Have you ever watched a cat trying to catch its own tail? Round and round it goes, spinning faster and faster, convinced that if it just tries a little harder, moves a little quicker, it will finally grasp what it's chasing. But the harder it tries, the more elusive the tail becomes. And then, quite suddenly, the cat stops. It sits down, yawns, and begins to clean its paw. And there, curled peacefully beside it, is the tail it was chasing all along. This, my friends, is a perfect picture of the human condition. We spend our lives chasing happiness, success, peace, love, spinning ourselves dizzy in the effort. We force, we push, we strain against the natural flow of things, convinced that life is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived. What if I told you that the very act of forcing is what keeps you from what you seek? What if the secret to having everything is wanting nothing? You see, we've been taught from childhood that life is a battle to be won. We must fight for our place in the world, struggle against circumstances, overcome obstacles through sheer force of will. This is the great illusion of our time. We believe that if we just try hard enough, plan carefully enough, control tightly enough, we can bend reality to our wishes. But life, real life, doesn't work this way. Life is more like water than stone, more like music than machinery. Think about breathing for a moment. Right now, as you sit there, your jinnah, your lungs are filling and emptying without any effort on your part. You don't have to think about it, plan it, or force it to happen. It simply flows naturally, effortlessly. But what would happen if you suddenly decided you must control your breathing completely? If you tried to force each breath, time each inhale perfectly, manage every exhale with precision, very quickly you would become anxious, tight, out of rhythm with yourself. The very act of forcing would disturb the natural grace that was already there. This is exactly what we do with life. We take what should be as natural as breathing and turn it into a struggle. We force our relationships, demanding they be exactly as we envision. We force our careers, pushing and striving until we forget why we wanted success in the first place. We force our happiness, chasing pleasures and avoiding pains, until we exhaust ourselves in the effort. But there's another way. There's an ancient wisdom that speaks of Wu Wei, which means acting without forcing. It's the way of water, which always finds its path, not by fighting the rocks, but by flowing around them. Water doesn't struggle against the landscape. It accepts what is there and finds the most natural way through. And in time, gently, persistently, it carves out canyons and shapes mountains. I once knew a man who spent years trying to force his way to happiness. He worked 16-hour days, convinced that if he just earned enough money, bought the right house, found the perfect woman, he would finally be content. He planned every detail of his life, scheduled every moment, controlled every variable he could think of. And yet, the harder he chased his vision of the good life, the more miserable he became. One day, exhausted and defeated, he found himself sitting by a river. He had no energy left to plan or force or strive. He simply sat there, watching the water flow past. And in that moment of complete surrender, something extraordinary happened. He felt a peace he had never known, a contentment that had nothing yet, held now. That cotton really fits. He felt a peace he had never known, a contentment that had nothing to do with his circumstances. The happiness he had been chasing for years was there, had always been there, waiting quietly beneath all his frantic activity. This is the great paradox. When you stop forcing life, when you relax your grip and allow things to be as they are, you discover that what you were seeking was never absent. It was only hidden beneath your effort to find it. Now, I want to be clear about something. When I speak of not forcing, I'm not talking about becoming passive or lazy. I'm not suggesting you should never take action, or that you should just float through life without any direction. The art of not forcing is actually much more subtle than that. It's about finding the difference between action that flows from natural response and action that comes from desperate grasping. Think of a skilled archer. When the master archer draws the bow, there is great strength and precision in the action. But there is no forcing, no straining, no desperate attachment to the result. The archer becomes one with the bow, the arrow, the target. The release happens naturally, at exactly the right moment, like a ripe fruit falling from a tree. This is what it means to act without forcing. You can still work, still create, still pursue your goals, but you do it with a light touch. You plant seeds and water them, but you don't pull on the shoots to make them grow faster. You do what you can do, and then you step back, allowing life to do what life does. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of us have been so conditioned to force that we don't even know what natural action feels like. We've forgotten how to tell the difference between flowing with life and swimming against the current. So how do you begin to recognize the difference? Pay attention to how you feel when you're taking action. When you're forcing, there's a quality of strain, of tension, of desperately needing things to turn out a certain way. There's often a voice in your head saying, "This must work, this has to happen, I need this to succeed or else." When you're flowing, there's still energy and intention, but it feels more like play than work. There's a naturalness to it, like a bird singing or a flower blooming. Forcing feels like pushing a heavy rock uphill. Flowing feels like sailing with a favorable wind. Both require skill and attention, but one is a struggle against nature while the other is a dance with it. Let me tell you about Sarah, a woman I once knew who discovered this difference in the most unexpected way. She was a painter who had spent years trying to force herself to create masterpieces. She would sit at her easel for hours, wrestling with the canvas, desperate to produce something significant, something that would prove her worth as an artist. Her paintings during this time were tight, controlled, lifeless. Then one afternoon, frustrated beyond measure, she threw down her brushes and walked away. She didn't paint for weeks, but slowly, gradually, she found herself picking up a pencil here and there, sketching little things that caught her eye. A cat sleeping in a window, shadows on a wall. Her own hand holding a cup of tea. There was no pressure, no goal, no forcing. She was just playing, the way a child plays. And something magical began to happen. These simple sketches had a life, a spontaneity, a beauty that all her forced masterpieces had lacked. When she finally returned to painting, she brought this same spirit with her. Instead of trying to create great art, she simply painted what wanted to be painted. And paradoxically, this was when her art truly became great. This is the mystery of not forcing. When you stop trying so hard to be someone, you become yourself. When you stop grasping so desperately for happiness, you discover you are already whole. When you stop forcing life to be different, it becomes miraculous exactly as it is. But let's be practical about this. How do you actually live this way in a world that seems to reward forcing? How do you stop pushing when everything around you says you should push harder? The first step is to recognize that most of what you think you need to force isn't actually necessary at all. We've been convinced that we must force our way to success, but success that comes from forcing rarely feels satisfying when we achieve it. We force ourselves to be happy, but forced happiness is just pretense. We force relationships to work, but relationships that require constant forcing are usually telling us something important about their natural sustainability. Start by noticing where you're forcing in your life right now. Are you forcing yourself to stay in situations that drain you? Forcing yourself to be someone you're not? forcing others to behave the way you think they should, forcing solutions to problems that might resolve themselves if left alone. I remember a man who came to me once, worried about his teenage son. The boy had been getting poor grades, staying out late, seeming rebellious and lost. The father had tried everything. He'd set strict rules, hired tutors, given lectures, imposed punishments. Nothing worked. The more he forced, the more the boy rebelled. Finally, exhausted by the struggle, the father decided to try a different approach. Instead of forcing his son to be different, he simply made himself available. He stopped lecturing and started listening. He stopped punishing and started trusting. He didn't abandon his role as a father, but he stopped forcing himself into the role of controller. What happened was remarkable. Without the pressure of constant correction, the boy began to find his own way. The rebellion that had seemed so destructive was actually his natural attempt to become himself. When the forcing stopped, genuine communication became possible. The relationship that had been breaking under the strain of control began to heal in the space of acceptance. This is what I mean when I say that when you stop forcing life, everything changes. It doesn't necessarily change in the way you expected or demanded. It changes in the way it needs to change, in the way it was always trying to change before your forcing got in the way. Now here's something that might surprise you. Not forcing doesn't mean not caring. In fact, it often means caring more deeply, but in a different way. When you stop forcing outcomes, you're free to give your full attention to the process. When you're not desperately attached to results, you can actually engage more fully with what's happening right now. Think of the difference between a parent who forces their child to succeed because they need to feel like a good parent, and a parent who supports their child's growth because they love the child. The first is about the parent's needs, the second is about the child's well-being. The first creates pressure and resentment, the second creates safety and encouragement. When you stop forcing, you can love more freely, because your love isn't conditional on getting specific responses. You can work more effectively, because your work isn't burdened by desperate attachment to particular outcomes. You will play more joyfully, because your play isn't really work in disguise. There's an old Taoist story about a man who lost his horse. His neighbors came to comfort him, saying, "What bad luck?" But the man simply said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned, bringing with it several wild horses. The neighbors congratulated him on his good fortune, but again he said, "Maybe." When his son tried to tame one of the wild horses and broke his leg, the neighbors again offered sympathy, and again the man said, "Maybe." Then war came to the region, and all the young men were conscripted except his son, who couldn't go because of his broken leg. The point of this story isn't that we should be indifferent to what happens in our lives. It's that we don't really know what any event means in the larger pattern of our lives. When we force our interpretation onto events, when we desperately need things to be good or bad, we miss the deeper intelligence that's always at work. Life has its own wisdom, its own timing, its own way of unfolding. When we stop forcing our small plans onto this larger intelligence, we can begin to cooperate with it. We can dance with life instead of wrestling with it. But what about goals? What about dreams and ambitions? Am I saying you should just drift aimlessly through life without any direction? Not at all. Goals and intentions can be beautiful things. The question is how you hold them. Do you hold them lightly, like holding a butterfly that might fly away at any moment? Or do you grip them so tightly that you crush what you're trying to preserve? There's a difference between having preferences and being attached to outcomes. You can prefer that things work out a certain way while remaining open to other possibilities. You can work toward your goals while staying curious about what wants to emerge. You can have dreams while being willing to be surprised by life. I once met a woman who had dreamed of becoming a doctor from the time she was young. She worked hard in school, studied for the medical college entrance exams, applied to medical school, but she wasn't accepted. She could have forced it, could have spent years reapplying, borrowing money for expensive preparation courses, making her entire life about getting into medical school. Instead, she grieved her disappointment and then asked herself, what else wants to happen now? She ended up becoming a nurse, then a nurse practitioner, then eventually starting a clinic that served people who couldn't afford traditional medical care. Years later, she realized that her path had allowed her to help more people more intimately than she probably could have as a traditional doctor. Her dream had been fulfilled, but not in the way she had forced herself to imagine. This is the intelligence of life. When we stop forcing our limited vision onto reality, reality has space to show us possibilities we never could have planned. The universe is far more creative than our personal will could ever be. But let me address something that might be troubling you as you consider all this. You might be thinking, if I stop forcing, won't I just become lazy? Won't I lose my edge, my motivation, my ability to achieve anything? This is a common fear, and it's based on the mistaken belief that forcing is the only alternative to collapse. But think about it this way. What gives you more energy, doing something you love that flows naturally from your interests and abilities, or forcing yourself to do something you hate because you think you should? What produces better results? Work that comes from genuine enthusiasm and natural skill, or work that comes from grim determination and forced effort? When you stop forcing, you don't lose your power. You discover your real power, instead of the brittle, exhausting power of will that must be constantly maintained through effort. You find the flowing, renewable power of natural action. Instead of pushing against life, you learn to use life's own energy to accomplish what truly needs to be accomplished. This doesn't happen overnight. Most of us have been forcing for so long that we've forgotten what our natural rhythm feels like. We've been swimming against the current for so many years that we don't recognize the feeling of flowing with it. Learning to not force is like learning to float. At first, it feels scary to relax, to trust the water to hold you. But once you discover that relaxation actually makes you more buoyant, not less, everything changes. So how do you begin to practice this art of not forcing? Start small. Notice the little places where you're pushing unnecessarily. Maybe you're forcing conversations, trying too hard to be interesting or impressive. Try just listening instead, being genuinely curious about the other person. Maybe you're forcing your way through traffic, fighting every red light and slow driver. Try accepting the pace that's actually there, using the time to breathe or notice your surroundings. Pay attention to your body. Forcing always creates physical tension. Your shoulders rise, your jaw clenches, your breathing becomes shallow. When you notice this tension, it's a signal that you're working against the flow instead of with it. Take a breath, drop your shoulders, and ask yourself, what would this look like if I weren't forcing it? Notice the quality of your thoughts when you're forcing. There's usually a desperate, repetitive quality to them. This has to work, this has to work, this has to work. Or, why isn't this happening faster? Or, I should be further along by now. These thoughts are like mental tension, creating suffering without actually improving anything. When you catch yourself in this mental forcing, try replacing the pushing thoughts with curious ones. Instead of, this has to work, try, I wonder what will happen. Instead of, why isn't this happening faster? Try, what is this pace trying to teach me? Instead of, I should be further along, try, where am I actually right now? But perhaps the most important thing to understand about not forcing is that it doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming responsive instead of reactive. It means learning to sense what the moment is calling for, instead of imposing your preconceived agenda onto every situation. Sometimes it calls for stillness, and then you rest, without guilt or restlessness. Sometimes it calls for speaking up, sometimes for staying quiet, sometimes for pushing forward, sometimes for pulling back. The art is in learning to feel what is needed, rather than deciding in advance what you think should happen. This kind of responsiveness requires a quality of attention that our culture doesn't often cultivate. We're trained to be busy, to always be doing something, to fill every moment with activity or entertainment. But responsiveness requires space, stillness, the ability to listen to the subtle currents of life. It's like the difference between a person who talks constantly and a person who knows when to speak and when to listen. The constant talker may say a lot, but they rarely say anything meaningful because they're not paying attention to what the conversation actually needs. The responsive person speaks less, but when they do speak, their words have power because they're attuned to the moment. Living without forcing is like this. You do less, but what you do is more effective because it's aligned with what wants to happen. You use less energy, but you accomplish more because you're working with life's forces instead of against them. I want to share with you one more story, this one about myself. Years ago, I was struggling with a piece of writing. I had a deadline, and I sat at my typewriter for hours, forcing myself to produce words. But everything I wrote felt stale, lifeless, false. The harder I pushed, the worse it became. I was trapped in a cycle of forcing that was producing nothing but frustration. Finally, I gave up. I left my desk and went for a walk by the ocean. I wasn't trying to solve my writing problem. I wasn't looking for inspiration. I was simply walking, letting the rhythm of the waves and the feeling of sand beneath my feet fill my attention. And then, quite naturally, words began to come. Not the forced, artificial words I'd been wrestling with, but something alive, something that wanted to be said. I didn't rush back to my typewriter. I simply let the words flow through me as I walked, trusting that what needed to be remembered would be remembered. When I did finally return to writing, it was like water flowing through a cleared channel. The ideas that had been blocked by my forcing came easily, naturally. The piece wrote itself, and it was far better than anything I could have produced through will alone. This experience taught me something essential about creativity, about life itself. The best things don't come from forcing. They come from creating conditions where the best can emerge naturally. A gardener doesn't force flowers to bloom. They provide soil, water, sunlight, and then they wait and trust. The blooming happens on its own. As we near the end of our time together, I want to leave you with this thought: you are not broken. You don't need to be fixed. You don't need to force yourself to be different, better, more successful, more spiritual, more anything. What you need is to stop forcing and allow what is already beautiful in you to emerge. You are like a river that has been dammed up by your own efforts to control its flow. When you remove the dam of forcing, when you stop trying so hard to be something other than what you are, your natural current returns. And that current knows where it's going better than your mind ever could. The changes that come when you stop forcing are not always the changes you expect. They're usually better. They're more creative, more surprising, more aligned with your deepest nature than anything your personal will could have planned. When you get out of your own way, life has space to show you what's possible. So I invite you, right now, to notice where you're forcing in your life. What are you pushing against that might be better served by acceptance? What are you trying to control that might flourish if you let it be free? What battles are you fighting that might resolve themselves if you laid down your weapons? This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or giving up on what matters to you. It means finding the difference between the effortful action that comes from fear and the effortless action that comes from love. It means trusting that life is not your enemy to be conquered, but your dance partner, waiting for you to learn the steps. When you stop forcing life, everything changes. Not because you've manipulated reality to fit your preferences, but because you finally allowed reality to show you what it was trying to give you all along. And what it was trying to give you is always more beautiful, more perfect, more exactly what you need than anything you could have forced into being. The cat has stopped chasing its tail. It sits quietly now, whole and complete, no longer needing to catch what was never separate from itself. This is your invitation. Stop spinning, stop chasing, sit down in the middle of your life and discover that what you've been seeking is already here, has always been here, waiting patiently for the moment when you finally stop forcing and allow yourself to simply be.